Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, here today with Jacob Gibbs and a very special guest. We've got Scott Barrett from Fantasy Points here. I cannot wait to get into the data he's brought to the show for us today. On today's show, we've got advanced stats, running backs, wide receivers. We might even talk a little bit quarterbacks, but mostly running backs and pass catchers. We're going to dive into some messy backfields, the Ravens, the Vikings, the Steelers, the Seahawks. I think we need to ask about Brian Robinson, check in on him. He's been fantastic the last couple of weeks. And of course, we'll talk Puka and Tank Dell. Jacob's here. We've got to talk Puka, and I want to talk about Tank Dell every week. Scott, first, I'd like to just get things started, though. Let people know what you've got going on at Fantasy Points, and thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Fantasypoints.com, best kept secret in the industry. Kind of don't want it to remain a secret, but really do think we're the best. Right now, 80% off our standard and premium subscriptions. The Fantasy Points Data Suite is 75% off. So you're looking at $50 for that, $30 for premium, the highest we offer. And we launched Fantasy Points Data, 6 months ago. And we couldn't be any prouder with that product. Really think we have the best data, the most accurate data in the industry. Bunch of cool stats that no one else has. And just the level of customization we offer is unparalleled. Really, the only thing you can compare it to are products that, like sites are spending, $15,000, $25,000 for. And right now you can purchase this for the rest of the year for only $50.
I probably should have just asked Jacob Gibbs, because it's not a secret to anybody who follows him on Twitter. I don't know what you're paying him to promote Fantasy Points on Twitter, but it's worth it. Jacob, why don't you just tell everybody, what are your 2 or 3 favorite stats that you've been
real quick? Yeah, Jacob has been my favorite person in the world because he's brought us such amazing publicity. Yeah. I hadn't heard of you until maybe about week 1 or week 2, and you immediately became one of my favorite follows. I have you on notifications. You're one of only 7 people, and not just I appreciate the publicity, but these are great tweets, great stats. You're using this the right way. You know what you're looking at, what's actionable, what's predictive. And so you're like the ideal power user, Jacob. So you could probably pitch this better than I could.
Power user. Let's go. Yeah. You said best kept secrets, and I was like, I'm doing my best to make it not. There's so much in the data suite. If you follow me, you see me talking about it regularly. It's just, really, it's a dream come true for me. I've been using True Media for so long, and True Media is amazing, obviously, but so often I have to tell people just no, you can't get where can I get this information? Where can I get this data? I'm like, you can't. It's not really accessible publicly. You can follow me and read my work, but otherwise, no. But now that we have Fantasy Points Data Suite, the answer is a yes, and that's really cool. Love the first read stuff, of course, all the matchup based stuff. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. Some of the new tools that's really good for in-season stuff for DFS players, which I love. Obviously, today is more of a dynasty based show, but I think that there are a lot of applications for that as well. Even just this is something that Heath and I talked about with Dwayne McFarlane this off season is wide receivers who are able to consistently beat man coverage early in their career. That's a great signal. That's a long-term signal. That's not just a matchup-based thing that you can use in the season. That's also something that's relevant down the line for dynasty players. So love the data suite. Think we're really only beginning to scratch the surface of the capabilities with it, which is really exciting.
And I think it's an important point, because we are going to talk about some rest of season stuff, some weekly stuff, some matches. But just because you're in a dynasty, doesn't mean this season doesn't matter. In fact, for about half the league, the next 6 or 7 weeks matter a lot more than everything else. And for half the league, you're trying to take advantage of that. You can probably use some of this information to sell some guys for a little bit better pick than maybe you were going to get before, because it is that time of year. We're definitely going to talk some trade stuff on today's show, but it's I know I've got a trade deadline hitting today. I had a couple trade deadlines that just passed on Monday, but it's the time of year to kind of make that move if you have a trade deadline in your league. We do always start with 3 questions for the guests. So 3 questions for Scott Barrett. Scott, what is, we talk now about targets per route run, yards per route run. Those types of things are becoming more and more mainstream. You see, especially on Twitter, like you hear, I remember like 5 years ago, definitely 6, 7 years ago, you didn't even hardly hear those terms. So what is the one advanced stat that you think people are not paying enough attention to yet that maybe in 3 or 4 years we'll see a lot more?
Yeah, you mentioned yards per route run. That's like the GOAT receiver efficiency metric. It's just so powerful, so important, so predictive. Really, like ESPN had their wide receiver rankings, and it had Darius Slayton at 11, and it had Tyreek Hill at 18. Really, like all you need to do, I think, for great wide receiver rankings is just sort by yards per route run. Like that's how good that metric is. Targets per route run, I actually think is a little overrated, or at least it needs, you need more context when you're looking at that. I think 9 times out of 10 though, target share kind of beats out targets per route run in terms of what you're trying to do. But to me, like the best metric, like if I could only pick one, is hands down XFP, expected fantasy points. This is one of the metrics that helped me make my name on the DFS side. I've been talking about this since 2016, and it's still, in my opinion, like one of the most underrated metrics there is. It's basically a catch-all stat to measure a player's volume, like a raw number. What is this player's usage and volume worth measured by, so I use a 10-year sample of play-by-play data, looking at every single carry by down and distance from the end zone, every single target by distance from the end zone, and air yards on that throw. So obviously deep targets are worth more than targets behind the line of scrimmage. End zone targets, red zone targets are worth more than targets coming, from the 50-yard line. And you just add all those up, and it basically tells you who has the best volume in fantasy. We know that's more predictive. XTD predicts it's expected touchdowns.
Right.
Predicts touchdowns in the following season better than actual touchdowns. You see the same thing with XFP, especially at the running back position, which is a position that's driven so much more by raw volume than it is efficiency.
That's awesome stuff. And actually, my second question was going to be about XFP. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that since you went ahead and brought it up, because that's telling you what the average running back or wide receiver would do with this opportunity. So how do you suggest somebody, when they're looking at it and they say, well, this guy is way outperforming his volume, or he's way underperforming his volume? How do we know when that's he's just a lot better than everybody else, or he's just not as good as everybody else, or he's been unlucky, or he's been lucky?
This is absolutely where I start losing people. So contrasting actual fantasy points versus expected fantasy points, it's a blend of art and science to try and determine that question you just asked. How much of this is, this player's due for a positive or negative regression? How much of it is, this player's just really awesome, and I don't care that Devon Achane is averaging 10 touches and 30 fantasy points per game, because he really might just be the second coming of Chris Johnson. And that is my opinion on it. He's right now looking like the biggest negative regression candidate I've seen in maybe 5 years, something like since rookie season Tyreek Hill, right? But this is a game, fantasy football is a game that's driven by outliers. These players who are just so much better than everyone else. That's Tyreek Hill. That's early career OBJ. That's Rob Gronkowski. And I mean, it's hard to say this with my chest out, only a 3 full game sample size, but I do lean more towards Achane as sort of, a transcendent player in that regard. You look at the top negative regression candidates. There's Achane, there's Raheem Mostert. That's part of it too, by the way, is just Mike McDaniel is a god. And then there's Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey. And it's nope, those guys are just really damn good. And then you look at positive regression candidates. So players who are falling well short of their volume-based expectation measured by XFP. And you see names like Dameon Pierce, Treylon Burks, Alexander Madison, And then you have like Tony Pollard. So like Tony Pollard, I'm still maintaining like he is due for a positive regression. The fantasy points are going to come. He's running really bad near the end zone, especially. That's something we know really tends to regress to the mean. I don't think Mike McCarthy is using him in an optimal way, and that's kind of impacting him. But I do, right now he's a low end RB2 by production and a low end RB1 by volume. I think, throughout the remainder of the season, we should expect at least like high end RB2 production. But then Dameon Pierce, he's just kind of dead to me. I don't think he's a fit for this offense. And we've heard Bobby Slowick basically say exactly that. And we've seen Devin Singletary smash these last 2 weeks. And so, of course, with this poor efficiency is, he was already I think Singletary already outsnapped him in his last game before injury. So that's not a regression candidate to me. That's just a player I'm writing off. Alexander Madison, I think,
right.
Sort of the same thing there. Robert Woods. Yeah, I'm not betting on a Robert Woods resurgence. I think he's just dusty. So again, it's a blend of art and science, and this is where I lose people. This is where it gets tricky. All I can really say is just read my article where I try and kind of filter through this.
Well, you lost Jacob Gibbs. He's currently deleting all past tweets promoting the site because you said something negative about Dameon Pierce, and he does not want to hear that. But
so hold on, real quick. I love Dameon Pierce. I was like, I was so high on him coming out. I think he's awesome. I just don't think he's a fit for this zone-based Mike McDaniel running offense. So we've seen this before. Like, how many day 2 running backs have they drafted who just are immediately outplayed by random like UDFAs and round 7 picks? Right. There's something to this scheme. And we heard Bobby Slowick basically say, I don't have the exact quote, but it was, maybe like right before Singletary started to, supplant him in the pecking order, was something like, listen, he's a great player, but ... like he just doesn't fit this scheme, is like how I interpreted it at the very least.
Jacob, I think that kind of gray area where we're looking at these outliers and definitely like the first 4 weeks of the season, Puka was one. It's like, how far is he going to regress? We know he's not going to keep doing this. But it gives me a little bit of comfort because it's not like the stats are going to completely do our job. We still have to determine which of these guys are really good and which of these guys are bound for regression, right?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I really like this whole discussion. It's kind of a bigger one and like more less dynasty focused, I feel like. So I don't really know which direction to take it. But yeah, the Dameon Pierce stuff bums me out so much, man. I hit on Houston's offense. I really thought they're going to be a lot better. I was super high on Tank Dell coming into the year and CJ Stroud. And I just thought Pierce was so freaking good that he would be part of that, rising tide lifts all ships. But no, yeah, he's not a good fit for it.
Well, and I think that's also, and Scott, I'll go right back to you here in just a second, but that's also like the narrative with the Dameon Pierce archetype, where the day 3 or the UDFA running back who, even if they're really good, it doesn't take very much to go wrong for them to disappear. Like James Robinson was legitimately very, very good. And then one thing went wrong and it's not a thing. So I just think like that's the problem with counting too much on running back talent when there's not a huge investment in them. Go ahead, Scott.
I will say with Dameon Pierce, people look at him as a day 3 pick, but he, if he went 2 picks earlier, he would have been a day 2 pick. And then he got the most money ever, like the most bonus money ever for a day 3 pick. They really did believe in him, thought he was more talented than where he ultimately fell. On Dameon Pierce, I just pulled up the fantasy points data suite, and here's exactly what I was talking to. So in man gap rushing concepts, Dameon Pierce is more efficient than Devin Singletary, 4.3 yards per carry to 4.1. But in zone concept runs, Dameon Pierce is averaging 2.35 yards per carry versus Devin Singletary's 4.1. And what is this? This is a zone-based rushing attack. And so it's just not a clear fit for him. But I think you brought up a great point that I think dynasty players consistently miss, and that's regime uncertainty. Or a changing in, a new GM or a new head coach specifically, or a new offensive coordinator really muddies the evaluation. And I think Dameon Pierce is a perfect example of that. Well, it's a brand new, scheme that, the previous scheme was like, oh, this guy would be he's a great talent and he's a great fit for us. You also saw that with like Laviska Shenault, who like when he was drafted by Jacksonville, they were like, don't expect much this year, but we have a clear vision in mind for him and how we're going to develop him and how we're going to use him. And what was it? Round 2 draft capital. So there was that investment in him, but it's like, this is a lame duck head coach. Right. And like, I don't know how he's there the next year. So that's something to keep in mind when you're investing in players or rostering players. What happens if there's a new regime that comes into play?
Real quick, Heath.
Yes, sir.
Specifically on the note you brought up about investment in later round running backs, specifically related to injury, I want to bring up Edwin Porras. I don't know if I'm butchering that.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Fantasy points, doctor of physical therapy. I listened to him on Late Round Perspectives with JJ Zachariason, and one of the most highly correlated data points relative to injury recovery was draft capital, which is really interesting. And they were speculating, like, is that just because they're higher drafted players are more athletic, higher drafted players are more motivated, something like that. And I think Edwin's contention was just that the teams are more invested, whereas like I used this podcast specifically to help one of my buddies. He was asking me about Isaiah Pacheco's trade value relative to like a first round dynasty pick. And I was like, he's like, what are the chances that my first round pick, he's new, he's not very confident like they'll make the right pick. He's like, what are my chances that my first round pick will be better than Pacheco? And I'm like, I get what you're saying, but at the same time, like there's a floor to Pacheco that you're not considering, where like if he gets hurt, which is very realistic because of the way that he runs, he's so violent.
Gosh, I think he gets hurt every run.
If
a normal person would.
If he's forced to miss time, like it's so easy for the team to just move on from him because there's no investment there,
Yeah. I want to stick with this running back talk for the third question, because this was a question I asked this summer, and I still have some questions about it. The per route data for running backs. I am interested, Scott, if you have done any research into how much of that belongs to the running back and how much of that belongs to either the system or the quarterback in terms of check downs and the guy I think of the most from last year is Ramondre Stevenson. Because if you looked at Ramondre Stevenson, there were advanced stats that showed that he was pretty good in terms of the passing game. And the actual production in terms of a per target basis was pretty awful. It was around 4.5 yards per target or something, which is not a great predictor, but still there's that big gap, which to me indicates something like, well, they're just dumping it off to him a bunch whenever he's running routes.
Yeah. So I have looked at this. It definitely is on the quarterback to a large degree. Something we notice is hypermobile quarterbacks target running backs significantly less than sort of statue-like pocket passers. Large component of that is you're targeting running backs as this sort of safety valve. Their pressure is hitting you fast, so you just quickly dump it off. Whereas, a Lamar Jackson or a Jalen Hurts might just flee the pocket and run and pick up a first down. And that is something you see, like the running backs don't matter crowd, which is like very mostly right. They'll look at, not to get into the rushing component, but looking at the receiving component, they'll contrast a running back's EPA per target versus a wide receiver or tight end, and it'd be a lot less. But like something I think they're missing is that oftentimes when you're targeting a running back, it's the difference between a sack, which is a massively negative EPA per play, and targeting a running back who picks up 4 yards, which is like a very slightly positive play. So you can't just look at that slightly positive number. You have to contrast it with a massively negative play. And like on this point too, is like the best coaches in the league all target running backs at an above average rate. Sean Payton, Bill Belichick, Andy Reid all heavily target their running backs. And so that is also, a coaching thing, a scheme thing. Right. And it's also, of course, on a player thing. Gus Edwards isn't going to get a lot of targets, but obviously Alvin Kamara does because he's great in that role. So I think it's a blend of all these sort of different factors.
Okay, good stuff. So we're gonna get back into the data in just a second. We do have to go real quick, Jacob.
I wanted to bring up DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift, target per route run rate, super high in college. First 3 years of the Lions, 25%, 24%, 30%. Immediately goes to Philly, 19% target per route run rate. Yards per route run below 1 for the first time ever. Just I think the clear example of like system versus player, like everything up to this point would have suggested that Swift is a target earner if that exists at running back.
Mm-hmm.
No, that Detroit situation for running backs remains fantastic. And I think there's something there too. And we won't get into this too much, but I'll just real quick. I know I've seen some stuff on Twitter this week about Sam Laporta and the splits for him when one of Montgomery or Gibbs are injured versus when both of those guys are healthy. And I do think seems to be a little bit of connection in that offense. But they obviously want to give the ball to running backs either through the air or handing off 35 times a game. But not if Craig Reynolds is one of those running backs.
Yeah, that was a great stat. That was by Jacob Sanderson, who in games Montgomery and Gibbs were fully healthy, Laporta has seen exactly 5 targets in every game. And then without one of them, or they suffer an injury in the game, it balloons to 8.7 targets per game, something like that. And I'm thinking back to what Kyle Shanahan has said about how having specifically McCaffrey and Kittle on the field at the same time just, provides this exponential increase to what this offense is capable of doing, because then you can move them around and get at least one of them matched up on a linebacker. And so it's just a little weird that, Laporta's targets have come down considerably with a healthy Gibbs and not much of an efficiency increase either. But
again, it's we're talking about a rookie tight end and a pretty small sample size that now we're chopping into a smaller sample size. So it could be noisy too, but I thought it was something interesting. Let's get into a couple of pieces of big news. We do this show once a week, so there's stuff that a lot of people have talked about. And from a dynasty perspective, we need to talk about Joe Burrow out for the year, obviously the biggest for dynasty managers. Jacob, I'll just go to you on this, and then I'll go to Scott on the wide receivers. If you're a contender with Joe Burrow, you're selling. What do you think this is a guy who's had a lot of different types of injuries. Kind of reminds me of the Keenan Allen situation when Keenan Allen got the injury prone label and then didn't get hurt again for several years. But are you downgrading Burrow any more than we're not getting anything from him this year?
I am. I'm a little bit worried about Burrow. I've actually been doing some trading with other dynasty players with Burrow, and I have a hard time measuring his value relative to someone like CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson or Justin Herbert. I think I would take all those guys over him. One thing is just from a team construction standpoint, he's had this great run when he was on his rookie deal, and now he's probably going to lose T. Higgins, and I think it's just going to be a much different situation than what he's had. I think he falls into the QB 8 overall for dynasty range for me, which is lower than he's ever been.
Yeah, I've actually got him and I think it's so difficult, Scott, because what we should honestly have is 2 different rankings this time of year. We should have a dynasty ranking of Joe Burrow for contenders and a dynasty ranking of Joe Burrow for rebuilders, because this year doesn't matter for half the teams in the league probably at this point. But I do think specifically compared to Stroud, I'd already moved Stroud ahead of him because I don't know that there's that much difference and there's a 5-year difference in terms of age. But now the additional injury, are you concerned all about Burrow, or are you just fine with it?
I honestly wouldn't have moved him down in my rankings at all. I think he's one of these unicorn values in Dynasty who just one of the most valuable players in the entire format. And, if I lose him for the rest of the year and I'm a contender, I kind of, I'll just try and find a replacement, but I'm not moving him. I do, typically take a massively long view in Dynasty, how Warren Buffett values stocks is the ideal holding period is forever. And so Joe Burrow is a player I want on my team for forever, but that's maybe just my unique Dynasty philosophy.
Do you feel the same way about both of the wide receivers? I was having this conversation last week, and the idea of if you were a contender with Jamar Chase on your roster, things obviously aren't going to go quite as well. And there's CeeDee Lamb's exploded, and I think really justified himself as that wide receiver 3, who's obviously much better this year. Is that something you're even considering, or both Chase and Higgins you would just like to hold as well?
Chase again, top 5 dynasty asset for me. Maybe wide receiver 1. Just want to hold him for forever, even if this is a lost year. Higgins, I don't know. I you can go back and forth on he's not. Chase is an alpha who's gonna alpha, and that's gonna hurt him. But maybe he leaves in free agency, goes to like the Chiefs or something like that, and becomes like a fantasy juggernaut in line with his talent. So I just think about that, but I tend not to, hurt myself in future years for the sake of this year. That's just kind of how I play it.
Okay, I'm going to stay with you here on Jake Browning. Do we have any reason to hope for anything other than awful? And is he a super flex replacement, or just let somebody else pick him up and he can sabotage their team?
Yeah, I think he's like nothing. I think he's like, Zach Wilson levels of production. And we just have a million of these guys this year, right? Tommy DeVito and, DTR, maybe Joe Flacco. And so there's just like a bunch of these guys. Definitely add him to your team. I probably wouldn't start him unless I'm desperate, really not expecting much. And I do think this crushes the value for guys like Chase Higgins and Mixon to a lesser extent.
Jacob, Mark Andrews also not necessarily out for the year. They're holding out hope. I think they're holding out hope for their playoffs, not our playoffs. So I am expecting to not see Mark Andrews play football in something that matters for fantasy rest of season. And I think the first question, and I didn't even think it would be a question back in August, but does Isaiah Likely even matter? Like, we saw this team play one game without Mark Andrews and just completely ignored Isaiah Likely. We saw Andrews leave last week early. Likely doesn't have a catch. Didn't have a yard. Absolutely nothing for him. It seems like that tight end role that was so carved into this offense is now just a Mark Andrews role. And if he's not there, it goes to the wide receivers. Is that the way you see it?
I think so. Just given what we've seen, but it's a small sample size. He's only run 106 routes all year. But yeah, with Mark Andrews off the field last year, Isaiah Likely had a 27% target per route run rate. It's down to 12% this year with Mark Andrews off the field. 68 routes run without Andrews, 8 targets, 54 scoreless yards. So yeah, I think the presence of the receivers definitely makes a difference. I think Odell Beckham is honestly playing really well right now, better than I could have expected. So yeah, I think we're looking at Likely as like the 3rd or 4th pass catching option in this offense at best. I don't know if he's going to be very relevant.
Scott, we had a question from the chat, and I've got a team that's in fact, the team I was talking to you guys about before the show that I'm so frustrated in. First place team or a contender with Mark Andrews. This is obviously a different situation than Burrow and Chase, because Andrews is a 28-year-old tight end. We're hoping we have 4 to 5 more years left, but he's of the age to where we might not. He's got Logan Thomas as his Mark Andrews replacement. I have David Njoku as my Mark Andrews replacement. Are you fine with that, or are you trying to sell Mark Andrews to get like a difference maker rest of season?
Yeah, again, I really don't like these trades where I could really see myself, kicking myself 2 years down the road. Like, oh, I wish I didn't do that just to, make a push for the championship. If you won or lost that, that could be really bad. If it's tight end premium, I definitely wouldn't. If it's just like PPR where tight ends kind of matter a good deal less, you can consider it. But I think Andrews is someone I would prefer to hold.
Okay, and somebody if you would target if you're not competing, right? That you'd like to have.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'd go after all these guys. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's kind of an underrated. Like, a lot of guys are thinking about, I'm compiling draft picks. I'm adding rookies. No, go look for these injured players as well, especially if you can get them at a discount. Jacob, the guy we saw pop last week and who has really shown some life recently, Odell Beckham. Would you view him as a buy for contenders? Do you think that he could be a difference maker down the stretch without Andrews?
I think he could be. Again, super small sample size, but he's averaging almost 3 yards per out run without Andrews on the field. And we saw them really kind of funnel things to him last week. Rashad Bateman has seen his route participation rise, but he's just doing nothing, man. He's averaging 1 yard per route run on the year. I think it might be Beckham. And Zay Flowers hasn't really converted in terms of efficiency with the opportunities he's been given. So it wouldn't surprise me if it is Beckham.
Scott, Zach Wilson has been benched. Some people were very excited about this. I think they're going to be very disappointed when they see Tim Boyle on the field. I don't expect any upgrade at all here. I wonder if you do, and I wonder how you're viewing Hall and Wilson in this reality that they're in, that hopefully Aaron Rodgers comes back and is Aaron Rodgers again at some point. But it kind of looks like they could be in QB purgatory for until the end of next year.
Yeah. No, it's bad. Tim Boyle, I have no idea how he made it into the NFL in college, and like,
it's so crazy.
32 games against like super inferior competition, had a 12-26 touchdown to interception ratio, 5.6 yards per attempt. He's been worse in the NFL. Like, I have no idea what they're doing, what Trevor Siemian did to deserve this. He should definitely play. And like, if that ever happens, wheels up for Garrett Wilson, who easily leads the league in first read target share, who last season averaged, 17.1 fantasy points per game with Mike White and Joe Flacco. And yet the Jets found the only guy who's worse than Zach Wilson. So this is bad. Not expecting much. Breece Hall, I think, is going to be fine. Since week 5, I believe he's like the RB5 by fantasy points per game. Just insane inconsistency there. He had like half of those games were under 11 fantasy points. The other half were over 18. It was something like that. He's going to be okay. Just massively inconsistent. And then, poor Garrett Wilson. If Aaron Rodgers stayed healthy this year, Breece Hall would have been a league winner. Garrett Wilson would have been a league winner.
Yep.
And it's just the way fantasy goes sometimes.
It is. And Jacob, we've got Steelers fans, I think, celebrating. Probably Matt Canada fired. I don't ever celebrate when anybody gets fired, but I do. Again, I'm skeptical that this is going to matter this year. Kenny Pickett's still going to be the quarterback. Do you have hope for any of the Steelers? And if so, who are you hopeful is going to matter for them late?
Yeah, I mentioned George Pickens as a potential buy on a podcast I did earlier this morning. And I wanted to, if we had time for it, I wanted to bring up first read target rates as a potential signal, and see what Scott and you thought about that. So just specific to Pickens, he does have a 28% first read target rate in year 2, up from 19% last year, which I think is really encouraging. And if we see him not stuck in this go corner post route 60% of the time role that he's been in under Matt Canada, then I think he could be like legit the wide receiver 1 there.
Yep.
Yeah,
so
I'm excited.
I want a clarification, and then I want Scott's take on that. But that first read target share is including all of the games this year, or what is it with and without Deontay?
All the games, 38% without Deontay, which would be like top 5.
So what is that? That means around 20 with Deontay this year?
I don't have that off the top, but I think probably that sounds about right.
So it's pretty similar to last year when Deontay's on the field.
I think so, but
okay.
I don't have it.
Go ahead, Scott. What do you think about these Steelers wide receivers?
I just had to pull up a stat from week 2 to week 7. George Pickens ranked top 12 in target share, top 10 in first read target share, top 7 in depth adjusted yards per target over expectation, top 7 in yards per route run, top 3 in yards after the catch per reception. I was always kind of a Pickens hater. So like, this was the most mind-blowing stat I found. And then of course, Deontay Johnson came back, and what did Deontay Johnson do? He just like out alpha'd Pickens to like a massive degree. And I think that's who Deontay is. I think he's, the drops are an issue, can't stay healthy, can score touchdowns, right? But he is an elite target earner, and that is something I think is really sticky. He gets open in a way that I don't think Pickens does. He's more of a possession receiver. It could happen. I would just be more bullish on Deontay. I think he's just going to keep getting his, and Pickens, maybe he was just held back by like the stupid route tree Canada had him running, but I don't know. I'd be more bullish on Deontay.
More bullish on Deontay. So a little bit of hope for both Steelers wide receivers. I'm afraid that it will be false hope because Kenny Pickett's just not going to be any good. But a little bit of hope, which we didn't really have with Matt Canada there. Let's take a short break, and then we'll get into some running back advanced stat talk. Okay, so we are back. We are a little bit behind schedule. Fantastic conversation before the break, but we'll move a little bit quicker through these. I want to talk real quick about some advanced running back stats, Scott, and I'll just ask you first, like there's obviously a lot. And I think one of the things that frustrates people is there are some of these running back stats that sound like they kind of measure the same thing that have different names and give different results. So what would you say, like which advanced stats actually matter for running backs?
Yeah, all the volume stats. Like for fantasy, all the volume stats, XFP market share, XFP per play, that's what you want to look at. Snap share also is really great. Snaps correlate better to fantasy points than touches, than carries and targets. Also, you want running backs involved in the passing game. Targets are worth 2.5 times as much as carries in PPR leagues. So important. In terms of efficiency, I like missed tackles forced per touch, yards after contact per attempt, maybe explosive run rate, things like that. That's important. But typically I'm someone who's just chasing volume because that's what's most predictive. That's what typically works. Unless you're talking about Najee versus Jalen Warren or something like that, then just give me the better player.
We are going to talk about Najee versus Jalen Warren in just a moment. I wonder, and I don't know if you got this off the top of your head, but how long does it take in a season in terms of either touches or time frame until these stats become sticky for a given season?
I don't know that. I start acting on it immediately for DFS. And that's the thing is in DFS, there's seasons within seasons within seasons. And so, these things change. We saw Jalen Warren get the start, I think he perfectly even in snaps with Najee, but coaches can come to their senses and make changes and things like that. So I'll just say it's an ever changing thing. I'm just always looking at tracking usage, okay, snap shares climbing for this player, declining for this player. Oh, he now has the goal line role. Oh, he lost, targets have fallen off the cliff for Josh Jacobs following this play caller change, things like that.
Right. Jacob, I want to just get right into going the opposite direction of Josh Jacobs in terms of targets. Brian Robinson has turned into Alvin Kamara over the last 2 weeks, 13 catches in his last 2 games. And not just that, but the guy is averaging 10 yards a catch. He's had some huge plays. And so do you view these last couple of weeks as kind of a transformation for Brian Robinson? Do you view him as someone who's a long-term asset, or is he strictly a win now piece?
I don't even know if he's going to be that because the remaining schedule is pretty brutal for Brian Robinson. I think he's somebody who can get game scripted out pretty easily. I kind of view him as a sell candidate, honestly. I will say what we've seen lately from a long-term perspective is encouraging. His snap rate was above 70%. That was the first time in his career that's even been above 60%. His route participation was obviously up. The receiving is great to see that. I think it's a little fluky because of the big plays. But also, he's creating big plays. He's playing well. He's avoided 18 tackles over the past 2 games. He'd only avoided 22 tackles in the 8 games prior to that this season. So I do think this is the best that we've seen him play at any point in his career, and that's exciting. I don't love his projection the rest of the way this year.
I understand that, Scott. I do want to hit on that big play thing because a lot of the stuff, I think we can underestimate how that impacts coaches. I know that we can look at the numbers and say, yeah, it was really just kind of one big play, but that big play might cause Eric Bieniemy to say, you know what, we should have the ball in his hands more often. Do you think that Robinson is legitimately improving or good, or do you think it's really just a couple of fluky big plays?
No, I think he's really good. I had Jim Nagy on my podcast when he was coming out. That's the director of the Senior Bowl, who was like, he's better than Najee. And you know what? I talked to people at Alabama who said he's better than Najee. And he looks it. He's been insanely efficient on the ground, really impressive there. And then what did we see the last 2 weeks? Granted, an Antonio Gibson injury has played a role, but 6 and 9 targets. And Robinson currently leads the league at all positions in fantasy points per target. He ranks 2nd in depth adjusted yards per target over expectation. To Jacob's point, small sample, inflated by big plays and stuff like that. But still, that's really encouraging. And that's still way better than anything we've kind of ever seen from Gibson. And so that's what's going to happen. Either Jacob's right, and he's going to be a game script dependent running back in bad game script on a team that's top 3 in pass rate over expectations. So not great at all. Or, hey, maybe they just kind of kick Gibson to the curb and fully unlock Robinson as a bell cow, and he's a league winner for season long league. So I think it really comes down to wild spectrum here. And I don't feel confident one way or the other, but that's how I'm looking at it.
And I've got him like running back dynasty rankings are just kind of absurd in themselves, but he's right around RB20 for me, which kind of expresses that possibility of a great finish and maybe even being a lead guy next year. And also the possibility of, man, could just completely disappear. That backfield seems to be getting a little bit more clear, Jacob. We're going to run through 4 that are not necessarily. And I just want to kind of talk about these guys rest of season and then who you like more long-term. We'll start with the Seattle Seahawks, which I think maybe one of the more confusing ones and also the highest upside because I love Ken Walker and I love Zach Charbonnet. And what either of these guys you could convince me could be league winners. Walker obviously dealing with the injury right now, but before the injury, we saw Charbonnet playing more snaps, not necessarily doing more and not getting more touches. How do you view these two backs? And do you feel the same way I do that they're both really good? It's just whichever one gets the touches is going to be awesome.
Yeah, I think you hit it perfectly. They're both really good. We've seen Kenneth Walker shore up so many of the inconsistencies that plagued him last year in year 2. I've been really impressed with what he's done, and I think the team has as well. But also, I think Pete Carroll loves Zach Charbonnet, and rightfully so. He's played really, really well. The remaining schedule is absolutely brutal for the running backs in Seattle. It's about as bad as it gets. But I do think the passing down work for Charbonnet is going to allow him to still be fantasy relevant.
Scott, do you have a strong take on which one of these guys is actually better? And which one would you prefer long-term beyond this year?
Yeah, I think Walker's a significantly better runner than Charbonnet. And so because of that, I think he's going to continue to get more volume and outproduce him. What Charbonnet has is like he is the much better pass catcher, but like when both are healthy, we've kind of seen that as like empty calories, empty snaps, where he's just like, okay, he has all these snaps, but he's just pass blocking. You don't get fantasy points for pass blocking. But I think he's going to go off whenever, if Walker's out this week and next week. But I would definitely prefer Walker, who I view as like, one of the best pure runners in the league and a few steps above Charbonnet personally.
Okay. Excellent. Let's stick with you for the Steelers, and you've already made reference to like everyone else in the fantasy community preferring Jaylen Warren to Najee Harris and just begging the Steelers. I kind of wonder what you think, though. Do you think that Jaylen Warren ever becomes the full-time back, or is it size-wise he probably stays in this kind of type of role where maybe you're hoping for 10 to 15 carries and he catches a couple of passes? And then long-term with Najee, like, is he just someone who's on your bench and you're hoping he falls into 20 touches at some point again?
Yeah, I kind of don't see that happening. It might be over. I don't know. If you look at Warren versus Najee, Warren leads the league in yards per carry, explosive run rate, missed tackles forced per attempt, yards after contact per attempt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Najee ranks easily outside of the top 25 or top 30 and everything minus one of those stats. The way I described it was like, this is a hot hand situation, right? Jaylen Warren is on a day Armis and Najee Harris is Rosie O'Donnell, and like Mike Tomlin's picking Rosie O'Donnell 60% of the time. It just makes no sense. Hopefully, maybe Matt Canada played a role and now they come to their senses. Just try this guy out with a bell cow workload. What do you have to lose? When last week, Warren had 110 more yards from scrimmage on fewer touches. It's just like the value he adds on a per touch basis is so much higher. I wouldn't be like investing massive draft capital trying to acquire him, though, just because we've seen so many times where like Austin Eckler might have been the lone exception, or Tony Pollard, where it's like, this guy's so much better than the other guy, just give him the ball, and it just never happens. These coaches are like, you give him the ball, he gets hurt, or it saps some of his typical explosiveness or whatever it is. But hopefully I'm optimistic. We'll see.
Jacob, I could absolutely. I want to move on here because we got to get to the next one. But I could absolutely see in like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or it almost happened after 1 week, people viewing the Ravens situation in a similar way, where we've got Gus versus Keaton Mitchell, and Gus is scoring all of the touchdowns, and Keaton Mitchell, man, the guy can score from anywhere on the field. Now, last week wasn't exactly encouraging. They did get him more touches, that we didn't get the explosive plays. How do you think Gus and Keaton Mitchell play out rest of season? And do you think either of them is going to matter that much after this year?
I don't think that we're going to see much change in the role from, I think last week is pretty much what we should expect in terms of Keaton Mitchell. They had been keeping him in a really limited role. But last week he got up to a 37% snap rate. And I think that's about right. I think he'll top out at probably 45% and hopefully take most of Justice Hill's work. I think Keaton Mitchell could matter beyond this year. I doubt that Gus does. But I mean, the dude has avoided a tackle on 55% of his rushes, which is like Jalen Warren territory. Like, obviously, that's a small sample size, but it's not just the big runs. I think that's exciting when you've got – that was something I would point towards with Achane a lot, is like he might legitimately be a special player because he's not just hitting holes and breaking off long runs. He's also avoiding a tackle on 40% of his attempts, like by far the highest in the league. And so when you combine the top line speed with the ability to make people miss and like spring open plays, like I think that's really exciting. So yeah, I like Keaton as a dynasty hold.
The running joke on our regular fantasy football today, Scott, is that Keaton Mitchell falls somewhere on the Devon Achane, Jaleel McLaughlin scale, and we're just trying to figure out where he is on that scale. And I guess you could put Jalen Warren kind of on the same scale. How do you compare Mitchell to those guys?
No, I think that's a fair comp. I don't know. My whole thing with him but also like Achane was I worry about the size. Like I don't ever see him being a guy who gets more than like 8 to 10 touches. Like he's just capped there, which really hurts him for fantasy. You can never really trust him, and like he'll just go nuclear 1 out of every 4 weeks on your bench. And Edwards is probably done after this year, but hard to deny like this near end zone usage and touchdown role he has, which is so huge for fantasy.
We've got a near split, it seems like, in Minnesota, and I'm not sure either of them are going to matter that much, but I know a lot of our listeners play in deep dynasty leagues, and so you might need to be starting these guys down the stretch. They were both okay last week. Chandler was better, but Madison definitely had more work. How do you split up Alexander Madison and Ty Chandler, Scott? Do you care about either? Is there a difference, or you just flip a coin?
I don't have a good answer to this, so like I just want to say I don't care. And
I understand that.
It's easy to say that when it's like, how much value is this in this backfield? That's, Josh Dobbs has played well, but it's not the same backfield it was with Kirk Cousins, and it looks like a committee. Chandler's definitely outplayed Madison this year, but like I don't think either guy really matters after this year.
Jacob, how many times can Alexander Madison fumble? Like, thank you, Kevin O'Connell. We've been frustrated in the past with coaches who bench good players after 1 or 2 fumbles. The James Cook thing a couple weeks ago was infuriating, but Alexander Madison seemingly puts the ball on the ground every week.
Yeah, man, you got to think that Chandler starts getting more opportunities. I think there's a chance that one of these two ends up being relevant, because we've still got the Bears, the Raiders, the Bengals, the Packers remaining on their schedule. So there's definitely a chance, but beyond this year, I doubt it's either one of them.
We're going to take a short break here, and then we'll get to the wide receiver advanced stats, and of course, Puka Nacua and Tank Dell to finish things up. So this is kind of one of those things where, like, it's just good programming. You save Puka and Tank for the end of the show to make sure everybody listens to the entire show, because they are the most exciting thing going right now in Dynasty. But let's talk real quick about wide receiver advanced stats, and I'll ask kind of the same question, Scott. And Jacob, you just follow. Which advanced stats matter the most for wide receivers? Okay, Jacob, you start, and Scott's going to unmute, and then he'll follow you.
Yeah, so one I'll bring up for Tank Dell specifically, and this is using the Fantasy Points data suite, is leaders and targets deemed open or wide open with a minimum of 5 air yards to kind of remove screens and stuff like that. Tank Dell is 5th, tied with Brandon Ayuk, behind just Tyreek Hill, Keenan Allen, and Jamar Chase in raw targets that are open or wide open. And when you make it a rate stat, so what percentage of Tank's total targets has he been wide open or open? 40%. Only Brandon Ayuk is ahead of him among the guys that I looked at. And Ayuk has obviously just been uncoverable this year. And so that's interesting to me. I haven't had time to really research this stat, but I did look at last year's leaders in wide open targets with a minimum of 5 air yards. And some interesting names that stood out was Christian Kirk at third. Overall, obviously has elevated his game even more this year, continued to exceed expectations. Brandon Ayuk at eighth. Obviously, we've already talked about him. He's been nuts this year. Cortland Sutton at ninth, tied with Devontae Adams. Michael Pittman at 11th. And those are two guys that have really exceeded expectations too. So I think that's an interesting stat that has a lot of potential. We haven't really got into much.
Yeah, I think Jacob just gave a great answer, right? With Dell specifically, as like, it really does look like he's becoming their wide receiver one. They have a special connection. Stroud actually told the Texans to draft him after they played together. This seems like his guy, and that's bearing out by first read target share by XFP. I think Tank Dell is ranked top 3 in XFP among all wide receivers in 3 straight weeks. So like, even if the production wasn't there a few weeks ago, like at least that volume is. So yeah, I think all that's great. Yards per route run, and I mentioned earlier, I think is one of the best stats out there for wide receivers.
We had a question, and I know one of Jacob's favorite stats, and you talked about this a little bit as well, Scott, the first read rate. And also, I want to give Reese some credit here because it's the first person who's going to get a 2 chat question through. So we got to it's a little bit of a long one. I've heard since first hearing about first read rate, some of the top QBs manipulate the defense by looking opposite direction to where they want to throw to move the safety. So wouldn't some of first read rate be QB manipulation and not necessarily them looking for a certain player first?
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect stat out there. It's just on the whole, it looks to be predictive. It could be on the quarterback. It could be, or it could be on the defense moving things around. It could just be, this is their guy and they lock onto them. So it's important to look at like a multi-week sample size with all of that.
You want to go a little bit, Jacob, about I know this is a specialty and we haven't talked about it yet. So you use first read target rate a lot, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to bring up Matt Harmon has said like basically all wide receiver stats are fake in that like they're all so dependent on outside, factors, quarterback play, coaching, defense. And so none of these are ones that you should get carried away with. But I think when you can use them to paint a picture of what's happening, and then use that context to help yourself make decisions. And then in conjunction with things like Matt's reception perception or PFF grades or whatever you want to use for player evaluation stats, I think that they are helpful and important. So specific to first read rates, I wanted to bring up 2 guys that stood out last year to me when looking at the 2022 data. I'm curious if there is predictability going forward with this stat, or if it's just something that's helpful in season, knowing how the offenses are functioning and really prioritizing players. So last year, Michael Pittman had a 32% first read rate, which was 14th. That was in the same range as Chris Olave and AJ Brown. And I think he's somebody who just really kind of went overlooked this year. This year, his first read rate is up to 35%. He's a guy who Matt Harmon really, really likes, and I think is kind of coming into his own as an alpha wide receiver. I'm really excited for him going forward. Brandon Ayuk, his first read rate last year was in the same range as like Travis Kelce and Keenan Allen, who are obviously offensive centerpieces. And we've seen him step into that type of a role as an offensive centerpiece this year. So those are 2 that just stood out quickly as like, guys that looked really good in this metric last year. This year, man, AJ Brown's first read target rate is out of control. It's up to 42%. It's actually ahead of Garrett Wilson, who's been like by far the highest all year long. He's now passed him. And so like that is nutty, man. Like AJ Brown during his time in Tennessee, if you just look at target per route run rates, stuff like that, just kind of like there was a lot of noise to AJ Brown. They had to suffer through because like he was missing time, weird offense, all that. But a lot of things pointed towards him as being like truly the predominant like target hog in the NFL. And he wasn't quite that in Philadelphia in his first year, but like in his second year in the offense, it's clear that he's like the alpha. And I think he's somebody who might get dinged a little bit because of his age in Dynasty, but I don't know if there's a better receiver out there right now. Like probably Jefferson, I guess. But yeah, his rate really stood out to me because Goddard has been healthy for most of that. You got so many good options. in Philly. The other guy is Puka Nacua, 34% first read rate, ahead of Cooper Kupp at 32%. When the two have been on the field together, they're almost identical. So like that is really, really impressive. And then I already mentioned George Pickens, but yeah, I'm curious if you guys think first read rate can be relevant beyond just the season that we're in currently.
Yeah, one of our writers, Ryan Heath, did a great study. I would just point the listener to that. Let me pull the link to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I wondered if that AJ Brown included last night, because he did not have a lot of first reads last night.
I think it is updated with last night. Is that right, Scott?
I haven't checked it yet. First read targets and fantasy football, Ryan Heath, fantasypoints.com. Check that out. They did a great study detailing all of the practical uses and use case scenarios of first read target share, both in season and next year, and its impact on quarterbacks as well. Yeah.
Ryan does great work. Yes, on the Tank Dell note and yards per route run, I just wanted to mention that Tank Dell is 10th in the entire NFL in yards per route run, ahead of a prime Stephon Diggs, with Josh Allen at quarterback, ahead of Jalen Waddle, who's just been like one of the best yard per route run producers of the past like decade, dating back to college. It's really insane what we've seen from him. His rookie season yard per route run rate is pretty much identical to like Jamar Chase's rookie season. I think it was 2.5 for Chase, 2.4 for Tank Dell. It's insane, man.
No, he's been, and he was like, I completely missed the Puka train. I didn't didn't draft him once in a rookie draft, but Tank Dell was my most drafted rookie this year. So I want Tank Dell obviously to be the best rookie wide receiver in this draft. But I think we'll finish up with that. We've had this Puka versus Tank Dell discussion many times on this show. I've run a couple Twitter polls the last few weeks, and for the most part, it'd been about 65-35 in favor of Puka over Dell. Of course, this week it changes to 60-40 in favor of Dell over Puka. And so I guess I'll kind of ask two questions to it. And I'll start with you, Scott. You can follow Jacob. Do you have a strong lean on which one of these guys? And where would you put the two of them if you're re-ranking this rookie class of wide receivers? Where would you put these two for dynasty purposes?
I think this is a difficult, really tricky one to answer. Mm-hmm. And it makes me like, I think you can just kind of throw out most metrics. Like I don't want to be comparing Puka versus Dell and, targets per route run or whatever. I want to look at like the macro, what's going on here. Puka, like obviously like an insane start to a career, has been more productive. A worry is that he's just like a Sean McVay invention. He's good. He's better than the round 5 draft capital he got, but he's still just, a round 5 draft capital wide receiver. And, maybe he's just playing the Cooper Kupp role, and like you could slide a few other like good but not great wide receivers in that role and put up this sort of PPR cheat code production. With Tank Dell, like a lot of really impressive metrics, but he's another guy, like that size. Is that something that's going to come in play later in his career? Maybe injuries, or like he's more one-dimensional than we're giving him credit for. And then it's like, this offense is insane. I think that's Stroud to a large degree, but it's also Bobby Slowick. But it's like Noah Brown. Look at what Noah Brown's done the last 2 weeks. And we're talking about Tank Dell's yards per route run. Nico Collins, as at least up until last week, ranked even higher than yards per route run. And so like, how confident are we he's going to continue to be this, wide receiver, clear wide receiver one in the team and putting up, fringe wide receiver one production, if guys like Noah Brown and Nico Collins can do this? Like, do you think they're that good? Like, do you think Noah Brown's that good? And because that's a question that matters when, okay, what happens if they draft a wide receiver next year in a star-studded cast or a class, or, T Higgins is available in free agency. Maybe someone else is. And so maybe this is the peak for both players. This is just sort of how I want to be thinking about it. Personally, I would give my lean to Puka. I heard a rumor this offseason. I heard it from two different separate non-related sources who said, don't expect Cooper Kupp to play much longer in the league. I don't know how real that is, like just a rumor, but what's the upside then if, Cooper Kupp isn't around next year and Puka's in the Cooper Kupp role? But yeah, so again, not stats driven. This is kind of just, big picture, zoom out, what's going on here. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I think you're right about how difficult it is.
Right.
I think that the key thing in terms of like the why is that these were third, fourth, maybe even a fifth round rookie pick, and there's an enormous opportunity to make a huge profit, right?
Right.
If it is the Sean McVay creation, if it is, well, this offense is just going insane right now, and eventually the league's going to figure out exactly what they're doing, and Tank Dell's not that special, then you might turn your third round rookie pick into a 2024 first round rookie pick. At the same time, if you do that and this is real, you're going to feel like a fool. And so I think comparing those guys to JSN, to Addison, to Zay Flowers, when they were drafted so far behind them, both in the real draft and in fantasy drafts, it's fascinating to me, but you're right. It's very difficult. I'm more inclined with both of them to just hold, but I understand the urge to sell.
I will say, like, my fundamental philosophy is that like upside matters more than downside is detrimental in fantasy football. And so like, I tend to just gravitate towards the player who offers more upside. And to me, that's Puka, talking about the potential Cooper Kupp role, that PPR cheat code role. And then just like the legitimate size concerns with Tank Dell, his ability to hold up or, really, put up alpha like production consistently and over a long period of time. Yeah. So that would just be but again, this is really tough.
Yeah. And I think one last question on that, because I saw some people in the chat brought it up almost immediately when we started talking about them. And I hear this a lot. So when you're evaluating guys like Puka and Tank Dell, and you mentioned that how long is Cooper Kupp going to play? I think that's a legitimate question. I think the rumor I heard this offseason, I don't know if it's true or not, is that Stafford and Kupp and McVay were probably all leaving at the same time, because I think those guys are all pretty good buddies. And so talking about quarterback situation for these young wide receivers, Tank Dell seems to be attached to one of the most young, exciting quarterbacks in the NFL. Puka seems to be attached to a very big question mark. How much does that matter to you when you're evaluating them for Dynasty?
No, you know what? That's a great point. I was just thinking, what happens if Kupp leaves? What happens if Kupp, McVay, and Stafford leaves? That is bad. No, and he was apparently really close. So, what, you might be right. Maybe in this case, that downside is really bad. And you can just argue with Dell, like he's right now, in dynasty circles, Stroud is getting moved up beyond Trevor Lawrence. And so he's tied to that throughout the remainder of his rookie contract. That's his boy. He told the Houston Tech. So you sold me. No, you're right. You're right. Right.
And I will say, like, I love that you brought that up, because I am a complete sucker for that quarterback friend narrative, quarterback teammate narrative, like that type of thing. I completely believe in it.
Well, they both have it. Yeah. The Breakfast Club. Puka got into the Breakfast Club this year. So yes. No, I QB to receiver rapport matters. Like that's a legitimate thing. So I'm with you on that.
I appreciate you hanging out with us here today, and we went a little bit longer than I told you, so I appreciate that as well. Tell everybody one more time where they can find all of what you do and everything that's going on at Fantasy Points.
Yeah, I'm at Scott Barrett DFB on Twitter, and my website is fantasypoints.com. Check us out.
Thank you, Scott. I thank Jacob for fighting through an illness this morning and making it almost the entire show. Thank everybody who was here with us on YouTube, listening on the podcast. We will talk to you next Tuesday.